The idea that Jesus didn't exist just bumps up against all the gospel accounts we have, the other New Testament writings, the other Christian writers outside of the Bible like Ignatius and Polycarp, Clement of Rome, etc., that are early, and the non-Christian writings.
Who all claim that this Jesus was a real person.
Yeah, there are some good challenges to the Christian faith we should take seriously, but the idea that Jesus didn't exist is not one that even most critical scholars would embrace.
Sean, one of the arguments that I was wrestling with as a prospective believer was, well, if this resurrection did not happen, then what do I do with my sin problem? Once I understood that I had offended a holy God, I didn't need anyone to convince me of that. My own conscience was just giving me lots of evidence, all the bad things that I had done. Even though I didn't believe in God, I knew that something had to be done if God did exist, because I had offended him. And I thought, well, what else am I going to do if I don't have a resurrected Jesus? Am I just going to try to clean up my act? Well, I know that doesn't work. Join some other religion? Well, ultimately, there's no solution for my sin. I found that to be a powerful argument. The other argument was from your dad's book, More Than a Carpenter, and it's the trilemma article. So he sort of took dilemma, riffing off of the word die to a trilemma, and said, well, Jesus said such outlandish things like, the Father and I are one. He said that he was the Son of God who was going to rise from the grave. He was the fulfillment of all this prophecy. He was either a liar, or he was a lunatic, or he was the Lord. He really is who he said he was. And he went through the evidences of those and convinced me that it was very unlikely that Jesus lied. Like, why would you go to the cross and be crucified and lie about the whole thing? I mean, like, you know, there was no back-end deal with the Pharisees. There was no book publishing deal when you're dead on the cross. And as far as a lunatic, I mean, mental health experts today would look at the Sermon on the Mount and say, this is the most mentally well-balanced man that ever lived. Love your enemies kind of thing. I mean, this guy was like, powerful. So what's left? He must have been who he said he was. I found that very powerful. But your dad updated the book and he added a fourth option, which was
the legend option. So it's Lord, liar, lunatic, legend. And I think the heart of what you're getting at this argument is, and what C.S. Lewis talked about it, through the history of the church, there's been a lot of writers trying to say, if Jesus really claimed to be God, had the authority to forgive sins, said, I and the Father are one, there's only so many options we have to conclude about the person of Jesus.
What kind of guy would say that?
Right, that's the question. And we rule out liar, we rule out lunatic, but more recently, people said, well, what about legend? And this can mean one of two things. It could be that Jesus really existed, but these stories crop up later about resurrections and walking on water, so we can't trust that.
Kind of like there was a real Saint Nicholas, but he doesn't really ride on a sleigh with reindeer pulling it.
Exactly. That's one option. The other one is this more mythical view that it's entirely legend.
That Jesus never even existed.
Jesus never existed. And that has gotten a lot of traction on the internet, because everybody has a microphone today, can make claims that Jesus didn't exist. When we talk about legend like St. Nick, one of the problems is we have such early evidence for the identity and resurrection of Jesus. So 1 Corinthians 15, a letter Paul wrote to the church in Corinth in the mid-50s. In chapter 15, he says, I pass on to you, the Christians in Corinth, what had been passed on to me, that Jesus died, buried, rose on the third day, and appeared to people. That is a creed that was given to Paul that he inserts in his letter that predates that letter in the mid-50s. Now, I think scholars can make a very good case that that creed itself traces back to within 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. So what that tells us, this idea that Jesus died, buried, resurrected, and appeared to people is not appearing decades or centuries later.
As some legend that was made up over time and embellished.
No way. The earliest heart of the message we have always is that to believe in Jesus is to believe that he conquered the grave, that he has resurrected. So I think we can rule out that from 1 Corinthians 15. The idea that Jesus didn't exist just bumps up against all the gospel accounts we have, the other New Testament writings, the other Christian writers outside of the Bible like Ignatius and Polycarp, Clement of Rome, etc., that are early, and the non-Christian writings.
Who all claim that this Jesus was a real person.
Yeah, there are some good challenges to the Christian faith we should take seriously, but the idea that Jesus didn't exist is not one that even most critical scholars would embrace.
Sean, what do you attribute the longevity of the spread of the gospel to? I mean, people have been talking about this resurrected Jesus for over 2,000 years.
So I think it's two things. I think part of it is the Christians very early took seriously the spread of this message, writing books, becoming missionaries, copying the Bible more frequently and carefully than any other ancient book. So part of it is the transmission. I think the other part is the heart of the message. The idea that God entered into history through the person of Jesus, lived a sinless life, defeated death. And that means you and I can be forgiven. They call it the gospel for a reason because it's good news. We see this all over film, like even in like superhero movies, like the superhero will lay down his or her life, come back from the grave as this act of sacrifice. This is all over fiction. But the claim of the Christians is this actually took place in history. And that means you and I have been forgiven. We don't have to fear the grave. Death is not the end. We have the power of forgiveness and the power of the cross inside of us. That's what I think when people hear it and they understand it, it's a message when you get it, you can't help but tell somebody else if you've experienced that in your own life. So that's why Christians are like, we're going to the Lions for this message. We're going to go care for people who are sick. Even if we get sick and die, Jesus has conquered the grave. So it's a message that changes lives. And so people have been telling this message across language, across continent since the time that Jesus came, and there's no indication that it's slowing down.
Sean, I'm thinking of somebody who could be watching this conversation right now going, you know what, this is great. I've never heard people talk about this kind of thing before. Then there's really answers to these questions. I wonder, though, if there's somebody who's watching who grew up in the church and maybe their mom or their dad was a respected leader. And so they never felt like they could really question this stuff and embarrass their parents or ruin their legacy or something like that. You can speak to them with qualifications that I can't, because I was an atheist. I didn't grow up like that. And so I didn't have any skin in the game to ask all of the questions. Would you just talk to the person who's watching in that camera right over there and just explain to them why they really need the resurrection?
First off, I understand that concern that you don't want to ask questions and undermine like a faith that's been passed on to you. But let me tell you something, God is big enough for your questions. In the book of Jude, it says, have mercy on those who doubt. Jesus calls us to love God with our minds. So take your questions, seek answers for them, and you'll be confident that you find them. I'm confident that you will find them. But also realize the resurrection isn't just something you think is true that you check off. It gets to the heart of who Jesus is. And at the heart of that message is that you and I have been forgiven. You know, like Kirk mentioned earlier, sometimes we have this sense of sin and this feeling of guilt. Well, maybe you feel guilt, and I feel guilty sometimes because we are guilty. But Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That is the greatest news, hence the gospel. And I'd invite you to seek it for yourself, read it, and the place to start is to just read the Gospel of John. I could send you some apologetics books, which are helpful, books on evidence. But the first place is to go to the Gospels and read John and ask yourself, who is this person, Jesus? How did he have such authority? Why has he turned the world upside down more than anybody who's ever lived? And how does that message apply to me? If you approach the Gospels with that openness, I really believe Jesus will show himself to you.
Hi, I'm Kirk Cameron, and thanks for watching the Kirk Cameron on TBN YouTube channel. We hope you enjoyed the video. A couple of things. Please make sure that you hit the subscribe button and tap the bell icon so that you're notified every time a new video is posted. And be sure to share your takeaway in the comments and invite a friend to join the conversation.